Welcome to our first Kentucky CASA webinar, and we're excited to have you. I'm Andrea Preston with the Kentucky CASA Network. I'm the Director of Network Training. This is our first remote in-service training, and we're excited to have with us the 2017 Volunteers of the Year with us, Brittney Thomas and Suzanne Churchwell. They are joining us as they attended the 2018 National CASA Conference, and they were able to attend some sessions, and they've learned some things, tips and information and tools that are impacting the way that they advocate for their children in the child welfare system here in Kentucky. We're hopeful that their presentation today, their tips and tools and information they will be sharing with you will also impact the way that you advocate for your children across Kentucky. So without further ado, I would like to invite Brittney Thomas to begin sharing with us, and then we'll move to Suzanne Churchwell after that. Brittney?
Hi. I would say for me, probably one of the biggest takeaways for me was what everyone was referring to as ACE, adverse childhood experiences. That was something that I'd heard about but wasn't really familiar with. And basically the concept of this is that things that impact you as a child, negative experiences, all change the structure of your brain, which basically would make you react to trauma differently as an adult and actually even as a child in your later years. And so the preface of the question was, it's not what's wrong with you, but it's what happened to you. And so that was pretty interesting for me. They had a really neat, unique experience called the brain game. I didn't get to participate in that because of the snowstorm. I had to go home early. But I did read through everything, and I actually bought a license for the game because I think it's so important for everyone to really play this game and to really see how trauma doesn't just affect you as a person, but it affects your brain structure, and it really affects your ability to work and deal with situations in the future. So that was huge for me. The brain game, it was just, I've played it since coming home and have done a few groups with different people, and everybody always has the same thing to say, that it's just really impactful. It's kind of like the game that we used to play as kids called Life. So it's very similar to that, except you're actually building a brain structure and going through all these experiences. So that was incredibly helpful for me. It really spoke a lot to some of the reactions that I've seen some of my CASA kids have, and just I look at that and I'm like, why are they reacting this way to something that's really not that big of a deal, or just something, why are they acting this way? And it just always pushes back to that basic question of what's happened to them. So again, that was a huge experience for me. I went into another session that I thought was really helpful, and it was basically talking about how when we interview our kids and their brains are under stress, it really is going to affect the answers that they give us. And one of the things the lady talked about in this experience was, she called it your wizard brain versus your lizard brain. And she said basically that if a child, and so these were concepts that she would explain to her children. And she explained it in that a wizard brain is the part of your brain that deals with logic, comprehension, understanding. It's the thinking part of your brain. And the lizard part of your brain is the reactionary part. And a lot of times when we're under stress or certain things have happened to us, we're reacting. We're not thinking. We're just instantly reacting to these things. And that's the lizard part of our brain. And so when we can help our kids and even help ourselves understand, are they in their lizard brain or their wizard brain, it can help us understand what they're comprehending, the way that they're acting, just a number of different techniques. And so she uses that wizard versus lizard to help the kids. And I wrote a quote down, and she says, when children understand that they have two brains working at different times, they're better able to cope in difficult circumstances by working towards getting their wizard brain back in charge. And so in helping kids get back to their wizard brain, it helps them to reason and rationalize and think of things logically instead of hitting, kicking, all these reactionary type of things you would see in your lizard brain. So that was just, again, it was really helpful for me to have that visual aspect and to really see that sometimes the kids that we're trying to work with and talk with, they're not in this rational part. They're not going to understand logic and reason and all of these different things. So helping them, there were some tips and containment activities that she went through that you can do to help your kids get back to a point where they're in their wizard brain, they're thinking, they're reasonable, all of those things. So that was really helpful. Another session I went into, they talked about the trauma of removing kids from their homes and how that affects them later in life. And it was interesting because she said, and again, it was a quote I wrote down, she said, kids with complex trauma will always find ways to remain attached to the families and parents they were removed from by becoming like them and repeating their behaviors. So she talked a lot about older kids and youth in care, and that many times if you look at their behaviors now as an older child, they're repeating the same behaviors that their parents had. And I've seen that with some of the older youth that I've worked with, that they're doing some of the same things that their parents are doing. And this lady seemed to think that it was an unconscious way for them to remain attached to their families, that somehow by becoming like them, they could be closer to them. And so that was a good takeaway, again, for me, just to look back and see some of the experiences and some of the behaviors of the older youth that I work with, to see that maybe that's what they're doing. Maybe they don't realize it, and they haven't been able to verbalize it, but that's what they're doing. So it would be a good starter for conversation, and just good information for me to have a hold of that. But those were some of my biggest takeaways. I just felt the really in-depth training that I received from the conference in terms of trauma and how that affects your behaviors, how it affects your understanding of what's going on around you when you're in your trauma brain, was just incredibly helpful for me as a CASA worker, so that I could look sometimes at these kids and see that this isn't just a way that they're acting, they're traumatized. This behavior doesn't necessarily mean that they're just acting and being a bratty child or being, unruly. It's actually truly a trauma response. And when we can understand that, when we can help our kids understand that, it helps them tremendously in their future. Because I think a lot of times I've even had kids tell me, I don't know why I do this. I don't know why I act this way. And so if we can help them understand it, I think they would not feel so alone and so isolated in that they're doing things even they don't want to do. So those were all incredibly helpful things for me.
Great. Thank you, Brittney, for sharing. I'd like to introduce to you Suzanne Churchwell to talk about her tips and tools and information that she learned at the National CASA Conference.
Thanks, Andrea. The sessions that I attended that I felt like were so beneficial to me were the sessions that discussed crossover youth, because I'm currently advocating for crossover youth. The Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University, which is based in Washington, D.C., developed a crossover youth practice model in 2010. And their hopes are to improve outcomes for youth who are involved in the child welfare and juvenile justice system. And when I started sitting in these classes, I didn't even realize that there were actually terms for these children. And Andrea, if you want to go ahead and bring up that website. So I was really excited to learn about this in depth. I had felt like that I was very much a fish out of water in this case. And it was really beneficial to me to learn about the different types of crossover youth. So first of all, a crossover youth is any youth who experiences maltreatment and engages in delinquency. So they've experienced some form of abuse or neglect, and they've engaged in delinquent behaviors regardless of the depth of their involvement in the system. Then there is a duly involved. So it's a crossover youth who has had some level of system contact with the child welfare and juvenile justice system. And then you go on down and there's a duly adjudicated, and that's a duly involved youth who has court involvement in both systems. And where it changes is the duly involved youth would be someone that is going through diversion. So the duly adjudicated youth would not be receiving any type of diversion, but so they would be a formal delinquent, so to speak. And when dealing with crossover youth, everything becomes much more complex. For me, I'm dealing with, people and departments that I've never dealt with before, the Department of Juvenile Justice, for one. There were some interesting facts that I learned. So there's a growing body of research on crossover youth that indicates that one, crossover youth are often in the child welfare system for long periods of time. Crossover youth are more likely to be female compared to the general delinquency population. Minorities, particularly African Americans, appear to be overrepresented in these crossover populations in many jurisdictions. Most crossover youth have been placed out of the home and often experience numerous placements, including multiple placements in congregate care. Crossover youth are often truant and or performing poorly at school. And crossover youth are perceived as higher risk by juvenile justice decision makers and receive harsher dispositions than their non-crossover counterparts. And we had talked about this in one of the classes, and one of the reasons behind this is because the family system can tend to be broken. So there's not as many people there to support these children. So there's not as many people to support them, to take them to community service or, to help them. So they tend to just go ahead and take them and put them in the harsher sentences, unfortunately. And there's some really interesting, a couple of interesting statistics that I learned. I'm going to read directly from my notes here. Let's see. Most crossover youth, 92%, are first involved in the child welfare system and then the juvenile justice system. And overall, maltreated youth are at a 47% greater risk for becoming involved in delinquency than youth from the general population. So I found those numbers to be, I wouldn't call them impressive, but I would call them, to me, it's just really scary to think that. And we had already talked about youth involved in the child welfare system generally receive harsher treatments within the juvenile justice system, less likely to receive probation, more likely to be placed in group homes or correctional facilities than delinquent youth without maltreatment histories. And given their multiple risks, it's not surprising that an estimated 56% of crossover youth have mental health problems. And in addition, crossover youth are at a greater risk for reoffending and being re-referred for maltreatment than juvenile offenders without maltreatment histories. And research also increasingly points to the importance of designing comprehensive integrated approaches for improving the outcomes of crossover youth, which is what CJJR does. They develop this crossover youth practice model. They then go into communities to try to make everything more collaborative between departments. They actually did they published a paper in August of 2017 that is titled Engaging Court-Appointed Special Advocates to Improve Outcomes for Crossover Youth. So I found that to be really interesting. And then another really important piece of information that I brought away was that research suggests that it can take 4 to 6 months for a child to recover academically after transferring to a new school. To me, that was huge. Like, it's definitely something that we talk about in court, you know, let's keep these kids stable, let's keep them in school. But this actual, and this was a publication from 2002 from Day and Williams. And this is also, all this information is on the CJJR website, and you can go to resources and you can scroll down to publications and you can pull up all kinds of information and read these publications, which I found to be very informative and useful. So I would highly recommend going to this website and taking a look, because for me, I love reading, I love numbers, and I love finding out, you know, anything I can about a world that I don't know that much about. And so for me, I felt like this was a great tool to help me advocate for the child that I'm advocating for currently, who is a crossover youth. And I guess that's it.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. It seems that we have a little bit of time left in our time together. So I think that I will ask some questions based on the information that you all followed up. I'll try to put on my volunteer hat here and think of some questions that our volunteers might want to know from your experiences. The first one I had was for Brittney. And my question is, you talked about trauma and how it impacts the kiddos that we advocate for. Is there anything that you learned out of the tips and tools that would change how you interact with your child, or change how you advocate for them in any way?
I think it would definitely change how I advocate for them in terms of their behaviors. I think a lot of times these kids end up having really extensive behavior problems, and sometimes it's not always understood why they're acting this way. So I would probably really focus more on getting some really good trauma-informed therapy for these kids and helping people understand that their behaviors are a result of their trauma and nothing more than that. They're a trauma response, and that with specified trauma therapy, those behaviors can also be managed better. I think a lot of times we focus on the behavior, but not why they're behaving this way. And so when we can get them help for that, I think it would tremendously impact their placement opportunities. It would impact then whether they actually get in a home or a residential facility. It would impact if they keep running away, if they keep staying, whether they could be placed with their siblings or need to be separated. All of those things get impacted when kids have really extensive reactions to trauma. And I think sometimes we look at these reactions and we don't incorporate the fact that they're often behaviors that really have a negative label. And so I would really advocate hard to get that label off of the kids and just put that more on, this is a trauma-based reaction.
Sure, thank you for sharing. And kind of a follow-up question, you talked about the brain game. Mm-hmm. Who is that game designed for, or how would you use that?
The game is really designed for anyone that would work with a child to help them understand the impact of trauma on the brain. So I think it would be great to use for your volunteers when they were recruiting and coming into CASA. It would be great to use with law enforcement, DJJ folks, to help them understand some of these behaviors. I think it would be an incredible tool to use with foster families when they're going through foster training. And I think it's good for CASAs. I think it's good for us to see that and to really understand that. I think it would be great for social workers, especially teachers in schools. I get so many reports from my kids' teachers about the way they're acting in school, and if they could play this game and understand how all of this interacts as a whole, I think it would be helpful for anyone who comes across the path of a child in the system.
Great, thank you. Suzanne, you were talking about crossover youth, and I wanted to hear a little bit, kind of the same question that I asked Brittney. It sounds like you learned a lot of information, and so is there anything that changes how you advocate for your youth, or any tools that you learned specifically in making sure that your youth has a voice in their cases?
I think for me, probably communicating with the Department of Juvenile Justice would be first and foremost. Obviously, it's really important to communicate with all the parties involved, but this is a new department that I've never dealt with, and sometimes when you're dealing with new people, that can be a little scary or intimidating, or make you feel like that maybe, you know, I'm there to support the child I'm advocating for right now. I don't necessarily have a role in the delinquency case, but so just a support factor, but I still need to gain information and to collaborate with the DJJ, in my opinion, because like the models, you know, says, it's really important for all of these collaborations to take place so that the child gains the best treatment, really. And what I found from the DJJ is that they have been extremely helpful and want to collaborate. So that barrier of that was a little like intimidating at first, really got broken down very quickly for me, and it was really nice to see that it was easy to work with them too.
Great, thank you.
This is Della from the KCN. I work with Andrea there, and I did have just a couple of questions. Brittney, for you, on the brain game, the license to that game, right?
Yes, there is a license to the game. So when I purchased it, I did purchase a license.
Okay, so how would one go about doing that? Is there a link we can provide, maybe on our website, or how do you do that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. They actually sell pre-assembled kits. The only downside to the pre-assembled kits is it only gives you enough supplies to play the game with 3 groups, the groups are roughly 4 to 6 people. So if you would buy what they call the DIY, the do-it-yourself, they will send you all the printable materials, and you just print them and laminate them on your own. And that's $100, and that gives you a license to do that. So there's a website that you can go to. I will send it out, but you can actually Google. It's called the Brain Architecture Game, and it was actually created by the Child Development Center at Harvard, who also developed the ACE study. But it'll give you one license, and then you can duplicate the materials to incorporate as many groups as you would want. So I've got enough materials where I could do 10 groups of 6.
Okay, that is good to know. Maybe we'll put that in our on our training resources website, Andrea, for local programs. They might want to use that. If we could link to that, that sounds like a great tool for that.
Yeah, it's real fun and interactive. The concept of the game is that you get you have these, what they're called life experience cards. Some of them are really positive and some of them are negative. And so if you draw a negative life experience card, you get a pipe cleaner. If you draw a positive one, you get a pipe cleaner and a straw. And then you have to build your brain with these materials, and the goal is to build the tallest brain. But so you're playing through the years. So once you get to age 5, you can no longer draw any more supports, so no more straws for your structure. And then at that point, negative experiences give you a weight. So then you have to start putting your weights on the structure that you've built. And once your brain crumbles, it's over. But it just helps you understand that the weight of experiences really can affect your brain structure if you didn't get a lot of support or straws early on in the game or early on in your life. So it's just a really fun. It's one of the few things I've gone to where it's like you don't have to just sit and listen to somebody talk. You actually get to play and incorporate. And then to me, I learn better that way. So it was just, I loved that concept. I thought it was done phenomenally well to explain the concept of ACE.
And one of the things I heard from what you were saying, that a takeaway that you're using or feel like you will use is to advocate for trauma-informed therapy for the children you advocate for. Is that right? That's the big takeaway, is understanding the impact of the trauma on the child and getting them the right services that they need to help them navigate.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of been diving into this head first in terms of just realizing there are so many different modalities for therapy. And oftentimes when our kids are getting therapy, whether it's through NATCO or their privatized foster care agency or with another therapist, it's not always addressing trauma. And so there is very skilled and intensive trauma therapy models for children that therapists can use. And so just making sure that when we say our kids are getting therapy, if it needs to be trauma informed, that it's trauma informed, because otherwise that's like giving that's like sending somebody who's addicted to drugs to an alcohol treatment facility. They're both trauma, but they're different. They're both addictions, but different types, and they require different types of care.
Oh, that's good. And then I did have a couple of questions for Suzanne. Andrea, can you put up the first sheet we were looking at there? Is that easy to do? Can you hear me?
You may not be able to.
Oh, okay, there she goes. I think she's done it, yeah. Okay, so where did this document come from, Suzanne? Because it's interesting to me that it's got the crossover youth practice model at the top, and then it's specific to CASAs. Who created this?
Yeah, that was a publication that the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform did, and they published it in August of 2017. So if you go to the website, it's cjjr.georgetown.edu.
I see.
And then you go to resources, and then to publications, and then you have all these access to all these great publications that they've done. And this is actually, I think, the second publication that's listed.
Okay, and so they have done a specific publication on how CASAs can advocate for children who have been maltreated, who then end up in delinquency types of cases, right?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
okay. This seems like that would also be a good resource, maybe, Andrea, on our website as how many pages would you say this is, Suzanne?
I think maybe at the most, it was probably like reading material, maybe, it's not super long. It may be 10 pages.
Okay, yeah. And one of the interesting things I thought that you shared, Suzanne, that I could really see how this could impact how a CASA would advocate was that statistic about how long it takes to make an educational recovery when you transfer to a new school, right?
Yeah.
I think that is that kind of fact, I think could really impact a CASA's ability with some, maybe encourage some urgency in why children need to stay in their schools if possible, even though they are being placed in foster care or
Right.
With a relative, right?
Yes, absolutely. I actually had an attorney ask me in court not too long ago how I felt about a child being moved in relation to education, whether or not I thought the child should be moved, if that would hinder their education or if it would be okay. And, I really didn't have anything to back it up. But now I do. I have something to say, hey, we know this child is going to face 4 to 6 months of backing up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a great statistic for me, I think, and for a lot of other people to use too.
Suzanne, based on that information, did they give any tips or things that you could be done to shorten that time frame, or it was just pretty standard no matter how the transfer went?
As far as the educational setback?
Yes.
No, they did not give anything. And I asked the question if the child goes back to home, like, does that change that 4 to 6 month setback? If they're going back into a school that they've been in, they're going back to their peers, if they're going back to their family, is that 4 to 6 months still going to hold? And I didn't get an answer for that. So I don't know if they've not looked at that, or if it just basically it's 4 to 6 months regardless, because maybe things can change once you go back into the home that you've been in. Maybe there's new rules and a new structure, and maybe it's hard to go back into a school that you've been at, but that you're trying to reintegrate. Maybe things have changed there. So it may be across the board, 4 to 6 months, but I don't have an actual answer for you for that.
Okay, thank you. No, that sounds great.
And if I can also follow up, Andrew, I thought that was a really good question. It seems like maybe also that it would be useful for CASAs. What do you think about this, Suzanne, to when they know a child then is moving and understand that 4 to 6 months potential setback, to then engage maybe even a little more directly with the schools and with the teachers, outlining the risks and asking what can be done, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
It seems like that would be a good tool for CASAs also on that.
Absolutely.
And then I found it very alarming that children who have been maltreated and end up in delinquency types of cases receive harsher consequences in court in the delinquency case, right? So that's statistically true then.
Yes. And it's because the support system isn't there. So a lot of times you'll have prosecutors, judges, whoever are making the decisions, saying, if the support system isn't there, how is this child going to do these things that are needed, like community service, and it's
that
a
makes
shame.
a lot of sense.
Yes. So, and I think statistically it's been proven that the kids that don't have the support system aren't going to do as well. So they go ahead and they just send them to detention facilities, or unfortunately. So
it's not really an indicator of some kind of bias as much as it is. I think that's an excellent point then, that because the support system that would enable a less restrictive consequence, for instance, isn't there, then that's not really as available for children who are in the DNA or dependency, neglect, and abuse circumstance to then transfer when they then end up in delinquency. They just don't have those resources and support.
Correct. For various reasons, their parents could be incarcerated. They could have no one. Their parents could have lost, their rights to them. So I think in CASAs, it's even more important, for us to be advocates for these children who are in the juvenile justice system of it, to be their person, because they can be cut off from a lot of things. They can be stripped of contact with family, with friends, with everything that they've known, and they can have no one, and except a social worker and a CASA, and those are the only people that they know for a period of time. And I couldn't imagine if that was me, how I would feel. So I think this kind of solidified for me, again, how important CASAs are.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
One number that I learned that kind of goes along with what Suzanne was talking about is they talked about this research study, and what they did is they looked at children who had been abused and in the foster care system, and they followed these kids into adulthood, and they said that the average lifetime cost spent in services to an abused child who grew up to be an adult was $1.4 million per person. And they talked about how important it is to work on a preventative measure, because once a child is abused and enters the system into adulthood, they researched, I think, up to the age of 56. So from the time they're a child until they get to the age 56, there is $1.4 million worth of resources that are spent in that child's life.
It's a staggering number to hear. Yeah, and it shows the long-term impact of being involved in the child welfare system. No matter what your outcome is or what your permanency is, and at what age it happens.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Does anybody else have any other final statements that you want to make, or any last questions as we wind down here? All right. Well, I just want to say thank you for joining us. It's been a delight to hear from both of you, and I really can see how these sessions have already impacted you going forth and working with the youth that you serve. And so we hope that the things that you all have shared, which I can't imagine that they wouldn't, will have the same impact on our volunteers across the country, or across Kentucky. And we look forward to hearing more from you. Just a teaser, they're going to be also helping us with the 2018 state conference. So you'll hear more from Brittney and Suzanne in September as well. So thank you again for joining us. And we just hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andy.